It was late October, the kind of gray season when the trees stood half naked and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke. I still remember the night my son came to me. My name is Frank, though around Maple Creek most just called me the man who built his house with his own hands. Not with the swagger of a young man who had the world in his hands, but with the tremble of a boy who had lost it all. His eyes, once bright with mischief, were hollow now, like the lights had gone out. He stood in the doorway, shoulders hunched, hands shaking, as if even his own body had turned against him. "Dad," he whispered, and that single word carried the weight of a confession, a plea, and a lifetime of regret. I knew something was wrong before he even spoke. A father always does. For weeks I had seen the late nights, the secretive phone calls, the way he avoided my eyes at dinner. But I told myself it was just a phase, that young men stumble and then find their footing again. I was wrong. He sat down across from me at the old kitchen table, the same table where years ago he had spilled milk over his homework and laughed when I pretended to scold him. Now that table became a confessional booth. "Dad," he said again, and his voice cracked like dry wood under pressure. I owe them a lot. If I don't pay." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The silence between us screamed louder than his words. He had been gambling, cards, online games, shadows that promised quick riches but delivered only chains. The number he finally choked out made my chest tighten. 6 figures, more than he could ever crawl out of. And the men he owed, they were not the kind who sent polite reminders. "They said I have 48 hours, he said. His hands gripped the edge of the table like he was clinging to life itself. "If I don't pay, Dad, they'll come for me." I wanted to be angry. I wanted to shout, to slam my fist against the wall, to demand how my son, my only son, could gamble away not just money but the future. But when I looked at him, I didn't see a criminal or a fool. I saw the boy I once carried on my shoulders at the county fair, pointing at the Ferris wheel like it was the top of the world. I saw the teenager who begged me to stay up late so we could finish watching the Super Bowl together. I saw my son, drowning before my very eyes. There is something about fatherhood they never tell you. It isn't just about teaching your child how to ride a bike, or saving for their college, or cheering at graduations. It's about the moments when their mistakes become your burden, when their pain becomes your pain, when you realize you would give up everything you have, everything, if it meant they could breathe a little easier. That night I didn't sleep. I walked the length of the house I had built with my own 2 hands. The wooden beams still smelled faintly of cedar. The floors carried the faint creak of footsteps from years past. Every corner whispered memories. Birthday candles blown out, Christmas mornings with wrapping paper flying, late-night arguments followed by quiet forgiveness. This house was my life's work. It was more than walls and a roof. It was proof that I had built something that lasted, that even in a world where so much falls apart, I had given my family a foundation. And now, to save my son, I knew I would have to give it up. The thought clawed at me: sell the house. The very ground I had broken with a shovel 30 years ago. The place where my wife and I once measured our son's height on the doorframe, marking each inch with a pencil, like we were tracking a miracle as it grew. But what is a house if the people inside it are gone? What is a roof if the one you love is lying beneath the dirt? When the dawn finally broke, I found myself at the same kitchen table. The light streamed in, falling across the old scratches on the wood. I traced them with my finger, tiny scars of a family's life lived. And I thought of him, my son, the boy who was now a man, but still my child, still the one whose life was worth more than any mortgage, any brick, any memory. I closed my eyes and whispered to the empty room, "If it takes this house to save him, then so be it." That was the moment everything changed. The moment I chose sacrifice over comfort. The moment I chose my son's life over my own home. It was not a choice of logic. It was not a choice of pride. It was the raw, unshakable truth of a father's love. You give, and you keep giving, even when it costs you everything. I didn't know then what the full price would be. I didn't know that this decision would carry me into a one-room rental with peeling paint and a leaky faucet. I didn't know the whispers that would follow me, calling me a fool for throwing away my security. But I knew one thing, as sure as I knew my own name: I would rather lose my home than lose my son. And so it began, the sacrifice that would break me, and somehow save us both. The second night was colder, not in the air itself, though autumn had begun its slow creep through the trees, but in the way the world felt brittle and unforgiving. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, a hurried shuffle across the porch, the sound of sneakers dragging like they carried invisible chains. When he pushed open the door, the hinges let out a long, aching groan, as though even the house resented what was coming. He didn't sit this time. He paced back and forth, his hands running through his hair until it stuck up wildly, his breath short, almost ragged. "Dad, please," he blurted out. His voice didn't belong to a grown man. It cracked, thin and desperate, the kind of sound that made you stop breathing just to listen. He told me about the phone calls, how they came at all hours now, a deep voice on the other end, calm at first then sharper, like the edge of a knife pressed closer with each word. "They know where I live," he whispered. "They said they'll come here, tonight, tomorrow, I don't know. Dad, I can't stop them." I watched him as he spoke, his body moving like a marionette whose strings had been tangled. He rubbed his arms as if to wipe away the chill of words that clung to his skin. He glanced at the windows, as though expecting to see shadows standing there. "Please, Dad," he said again, his knees buckling until he sank onto the floor. He pressed his forehead against the wooden boards as if the ground itself could show him mercy. "I don't want to die." The words hung in the room, heavy as lead. They didn't belong in the mouth of my son, not the boy I once taught to swim, who splashed with fearless laughter in the summer lake, not the young man who swore he'd never need saving again. But here he was, begging like a child in the dark. The clock ticked in the corner. Each second sounded louder than the last, a hammer driving home the truth. Time was running out. I could smell his sweat, sharp and sour, as if fear itself had a scent. His shirt clung damp against his back, and when he finally lifted his head, I saw tears streaking through the grime on his face. 48 hours, he said. His lips trembled around the number. "That's all they gave me, 48. If I don't pay," he stopped, his throat closing on the words. His silence was worse than any threat he could repeat. I wanted to reach for him, to pull him up, to steady those shaking shoulders, but my hands stayed where they were, flat against the table, as if pinned by the weight of the choice forming in front of me. A father is supposed to be strong, to stand tall when his child is crumbling. Yet in that moment I felt small, like a man staring at a fire already too wide to smother. "I'll change, Dad," he whispered suddenly, his voice raw, scraped thin. "I swear it, I'll quit everything. I'll work 2 jobs, just save me this one time, please." The word please fractured him. He repeated it again and again, each one softer, as if repetition alone might conjure a miracle. I listened. Every syllable cut into me like glass, not because of the danger outside, but because of the danger inside. The hunger, the weakness, this beast called addiction that had stolen my son and left me with this trembling figure in its place. Outside, a dog barked. The sound tore through the night, sharp and sudden, and he flinched so violently his hands flew to his ears. "They're coming," he gasped. "They're watching me, I know it." His eyes darted toward the window again. In the pale glow of the streetlight, his face looked older than mine, creased not with years but with fear. I knelt beside him, not as the man who built this house, not as the provider or the protector, but simply as a father who could not bear the thought of his child breaking beyond repair. "Look at me," I said softly. It took a moment, but finally he did. His pupils were wide, swallowed whole by terror, like black holes pulling everything inward. "I'm here," I told him. "They won't touch you tonight, not while I'm breathing." He collapsed against me then, his chest heaving, his sobs muffled into the fabric of my shirt. The weight of him was heavy, yet it was the kind of burden I would never set down. I held him as the clock marked the hours, as the shadows shifted across the floor, as the night pressed on with its cruel indifference. And though I didn't say it out loud, one truth echoed inside me with every heartbeat. I had 48 hours to save my son, and I knew the cost would be everything I had. When he finally fell asleep on the couch, his breathing uneven but calmer than before, I stayed awake. I watched the rise and fall of his chest, the twitch of his fingers even in rest, as if the fear chased him into his dreams. The room was dark except for the low glow of a lamp in the corner. Its light spilled across the framed photographs lining the shelf. Dust clung to the glass, turning each image into something distant, like a memory seen through fog. I stood and traced my finger across one of them. My son at 5, grinning with 2 missing front teeth, holding a toy hammer. He had wanted to help me that day, help me lay the first floorboards of this very house. I can still hear the echo of that hammer, tiny taps against wood, more noise than progress. But he was so proud. He wore a little tool belt I had bought him from the hardware store. Too big for his waist, it slipped down every few minutes, and he'd yank it back up with both hands, declaring himself my assistant. The smell of sawdust clung to everything then. It settled in our hair, our clothes, even the food we ate. But I never minded. It was the scent of building, of becoming, of making something that could outlast us. And when he toddled beside me with his hammer, I believed I was teaching him more than carpentry. I thought I was teaching him what it meant to build a life. Years later, when the house was finished, we painted the walls together. The living room first. He was 12, restless and impatient, streaking color across the plaster like it was a race. Paint smeared his cheek, his elbows, the back of his hand. When I pointed it out, he laughed so hard he dropped the roller. That laugh still lives in my bones. Sharp, free, unburdened. The sound of a boy who didn't yet know what it meant to owe anyone anything. I remember the winters most of all, the way the house groaned under heavy snow, the wind rattling the windows while we gathered near the fireplace. He would press close to the flames, cheeks flushed red, the scent of burning oak filling the air. Sometimes, when the storm howled outside, he'd crawl onto my lap, already too big for it but unwilling to let go of the comfort. He'd rest his head against my chest and ask questions that seemed to come out of nowhere. Dad, how do you know when you're strong enough? Dad, why do people hurt each other? Dad, will you always be here? And I answered the only way I knew how. Strong enough means you keep going. People hurt each other because they forget what love is. And yes, always. At the time, I believed those words with all my heart. Now, looking at him, older, heavier, trembling under the weight of debts he couldn't carry, I wondered if I had failed him. Had I given him too much shelter? Had I protected him so fiercely that he never learned how to weather a storm on his own? It's a cruel trick of memory. The moments you thought were triumphs, teaching him, guiding him, building alongside him, they come back in the quiet hours and whisper accusations. The night deepened. Outside, a train horn wailed in the distance, long and mournful, the kind of sound that makes you think of all the places you'll never go. It rattled the glass, and for a moment I thought of leaving, of packing a bag, walking out, letting the boy face the ruin he had created. But then I saw him again, his mouth slightly open, a streak of dried tears across his temple, the faint snore of exhaustion, and I couldn't move, because love isn't logical. It doesn't weigh mistakes against sacrifices. It doesn't add, subtract, or keep accounts. Love remembers the boy with the toy hammer, the laughter splashed in paint, the questions whispered by the fire. And love decides again and again that no matter how far he falls, you will not let him be taken. My hand brushed the photograph once more before I set it back on the shelf. The glass was cold beneath my fingers, cold like the nights to come. In the stillness, I made myself a silent vow. If I had to give away every piece of this house, every wall, every memory soaked into its beams, I would do it, not because the house meant nothing, but because my son still meant everything. The morning came gray, like the sky itself was undecided. Clouds hung low, swollen but silent, as if the heavens were holding back a storm. I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The taste was bitter on my tongue, but I drank anyway, needing something to anchor me while the world in my head spun out of control. Across the room, my son stirred on the couch. His hair stuck in wild tufts, his face pale, the kind of pale that comes not from sleeplessness alone, but from living too close to fear for too long. He didn't wake. His body was too worn out from nights of dread, and I almost envied him that slumber. I stared at him, at the faint stubble on his chin, the twitch of his lip, the faint trace of the boy he used to be buried under the man he had become. And then I looked past him, to the walls around us, to the beams that had once been just raw lumber and a dream. It was strange how quickly the walls seemed to shift in my eyes. Yesterday they had felt like protection. Today they looked like currency. 4 walls, a roof, memories soaked into plaster, but to the world outside it was numbers, square footage, market value, collateral. The thought struck me hard. The only way to save my son's life was to trade away the life I had built. I tried to fight it at first. My mind searched for other solutions, a loan, a friend, some hidden resource I'd overlooked. But the numbers didn't bend. The clock ticked toward 48 hours, and every alternative collapsed like wet paper in my hands. I pressed my palms against my temples, feeling the pulse of blood beneath my skin. My body was a taut wire, buzzing with exhaustion and panic. In the silence, I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant hiss of a truck braking on the street outside. Ordinary sounds, but each one seemed amplified, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to decide. When I finally stood, my chair scraped against the tile with a sharp, jarring note. It startled him awake. He blinked at me, dazed, the lines of sleep still etched into his face. "Dad," he murmured. Evan's voice, strained and unsteady, made him sound younger than his 26 years. I didn't answer right away. My throat felt like it had closed around something too heavy to swallow. Instead, I walked to the window. The glass was cool beneath my fingertips. Outside, the maple trees swayed, their leaves flashing a muted gold in the dull light. A season of change. The world reminding me that nothing lasts forever. "I'm going to fix this," I said at last. My voice sounded foreign in my own ears, low, firm, carrying a finality that made him sit up straighter. His eyes widened as though hope had just been set before him like a feast. But there was fear in them too, because he knew, as I did, that nothing I had left to give would come without cost. "Dad, how?" he asked. His voice cracked on the word, and I could see him bracing for an answer he might not want to hear. I turned back to the room, to the table scarred by years of use, to the photographs watching silently from their frames, to the couch where my son sat, still trembling from a nightmare not yet finished. And in that moment I knew with a clarity that cut through the fog of indecision like a blade. "I'll sell the house," I said. The words were plain, almost quiet, but they carried the weight of a wrecking ball. He froze. For a heartbeat, he looked at me as though I'd spoken in another language, and then his face crumpled. "No, Dad, you can't. This house, it's everything you've worked for. It's your whole life." He was right, but he didn't understand. What good is a whole life if your child's is about to be cut short? I walked to him and laid a hand on his shoulder. His skin was clammy, the muscle beneath it tense as stone. He looked up at me with eyes rimmed red from sleeplessness and tears. "You are my whole life," I whispered. There it was, the decision that defied reason, that spat in the face of pride and practicality. A reckless decision, some would say, but to me it was the only one left. I straightened, feeling the floor steady beneath me. The boards creaked faintly under my weight, as if the house itself understood what I was about to do, as if it was already preparing to say goodbye. And in that silence, with the gray morning pressing against the glass, I accepted it fully. I would trade brick and wood, memory and sweat, for the one thing I could not rebuild if it were lost: my son's life. The office smelled of paper and ink, that sharp, metallic tang of fresh toner mixed with the faint polish of old wood. It was a smell I had always associated with bureaucracy, mortgages, taxes, paperwork that bound lives to numbers. But that morning it carried something heavier. It smelled like loss waiting to be signed. The realtor slid the folder across the desk toward me. A neat stack, stapled in the corner, black letters on white pages that seemed almost too clean for what they contained. Her nails clicked softly against the paper as she tapped where my signature would go. "Once you sign here," she said gently, "it's done." Her voice was practiced, careful, the tone of someone who had seen people let go of their homes before. But I could tell by the way she avoided looking directly into my eyes that she knew this was different. My hand hovered above the pen. The weight of it surprised me. A simple cylinder of plastic, yet it felt as heavy as a crowbar, as though by lifting it I would pry open a door I could never close again. I glanced at the window. Outside, the sky was washed in a dull blue, the kind of color that looks tired, like it has been stretched too thin. Cars passed on the street below, their engines a steady hum, reminding me the world wasn't stopping for my decision. But mine was. I thought of my son, still at home, still on that couch, his body curled inward as though bracing against invisible blows. The phone calls would come again, I had no doubt. The men he owed would not wait, and by tomorrow they would collect. I swallowed hard. My throat burned, raw from nights without rest. The coffee I'd drunk earlier soured in my stomach, a churn of acid and dread. "Sir." The realtor's voice broke the silence. Her hands folded neatly on the desk now, waiting. The clock on the wall ticked once, twice, each sound a reminder that hesitation had its own cost. I pressed the pen to paper. The first stroke of ink looked harmless, a simple curve, but my chest tightened as though I had opened a vein. Every line I wrote bled something out of me. 30 years of labor, nights of overtime, weekends sacrificed so that mortgage checks wouldn't bounce. Each flick of the pen stripped another piece away. The smell of sawdust that once clung to my clothes, the echo of laughter when we first moved in, the quiet pride of locking the front door at night knowing my family was safe. By the time I reached the final page, my hand trembled, not from weakness, but from the sheer force of what it meant. This house was no longer mine. The realtor slid the papers back, stacked them neatly, and clipped them with a silver fastener that snapped shut like a trap. "Congratulations," she said softly, almost mechanically. "It should close in less than 48 hours. Congratulations." The word rang bitter, like a joke no one dared laugh at. I stepped outside into the daylight. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of exhaust from passing cars. A gust lifted the edges of my jacket, and for a brief moment I felt hollowed out, like the papers I just signed had scooped the marrow from my bones. But then I remembered the number. The sum the sale would bring, enough to wipe his debt clean. Enough to buy my son time to live, time to try again. And though the thought didn't soothe the ache in my chest, it gave me something to hold on to. That evening when I returned home, he was waiting at the table, his face still pale but his eyes searching mine for an answer. "Well?" he asked, his voice almost breaking. I laid the folder down in front of him. He touched the edge with cautious fingers as though it might burn. "It's done," I said. The words were heavy, flat, final. For a moment relief flickered across his face, a light in the darkness. But it didn't last. His eyes filled quickly with something else. Something I couldn't name then. Shame, maybe. Or the beginning of a guilt too large to carry. I poured myself a glass of water. The faucet groaned as it ran, the pipes shuddering with age, as though even the house itself sensed the betrayal. When I lifted the glass to my lips, the water tasted metallic, almost bitter. I swallowed anyway, letting it wash down the last traces of doubt, because what I had signed today was more than a contract. It was a covenant written in ink but sealed in blood, my years, my labor, and it bound me not to a bank or a buyer, but to the only truth I could not escape. To save my son, I would give away everything else. That night I carried an envelope thicker than I ever thought I'd hold. It wasn't money, it was years, memories. The house itself turned into numbers. The man on the phone had told me where to meet. A parking lot behind a shuttered gas station, the kind of place where light flickers but never stays steady. When I stepped out of the car, my breath hung in the air. 3 men stood waiting, their coats dark, their eyes colder still. One of them, broad shoulders, a scar across his cheek, stepped forward. "You're on time," he said flatly. 48 hours means 48. I handed him the envelope. My hand shook, though I tried to hide it. He counted quickly, bills snapping like fire in the cold. Finally, he looked up. "We're square for now." The words echoed as I turned away, my chest hollow, my legs heavy. I had saved my son from them, but I knew the real battle was only just beginning. For 2 days, the house felt strangely weightless. Not because its burdens were gone, but because they had been sold off with the papers I'd signed. I moved through each room as though walking through a dream, aware that the walls still stood, the floors still carried my steps, yet none of it truly belonged to me anymore. My son tried to smile in those days. He carried himself lighter, his shoulders no longer hunched in terror of the calls that had once haunted every hour. When the phone rang, he didn't flinch. When the mail arrived, he didn't hide. Relief looked good on him, but it didn't last. The first crack came one evening, subtle but sharp. I had returned from work later than usual. The air outside carried the scent of rain, and my jacket clung damp to my skin. When I stepped inside, I found him at the kitchen counter with a bottle of beer, just one, but it gleamed there like a warning sign. "You're drinking?" I asked. My voice was calm, but the words hung heavy. "It's nothing," he shrugged, taking a casual sip as though I had questioned the weather. "After everything, I think I've earned one." The way he said it, earned, made something twist inside me. I wanted to remind him that what he had been given wasn't a reward. It was a reprieve, paid for in ink and blood, but the words caught in my throat. I let it go, though the taste of unease stayed bitter in my mouth. A week later, I found him gone when I came home. The couch where he had been sleeping was empty, the blanket folded in a careless heap. At first, I told myself he had stepped out for air, maybe gone to a store, but hours passed, and the night deepened. The ticking of the clock grew unbearable. When the door finally opened, the smell hit me first. Not beer this time, but the acrid tang of cigarettes, the faint trace of whiskey clinging to his jacket. He tried to slip past me, but the floor betrayed him, a groan of old wood under his weight. "Where were you?" I asked. He didn't answer. His jaw tightened, eyes fixed anywhere but mine. Trust doesn't shatter all at once. It fractures slowly, hairline cracks invisible until suddenly the whole pain gives way. In the days that followed, I watched him drift further from me. His laughter returned, but it wasn't the kind I recognized. It was louder, careless, the laughter of someone trying too hard to prove they were free. Money disappeared too. At first small, 20 here, 40 there. I noticed my wallet felt lighter, but I told myself I had simply forgotten. Until one evening I opened the drawer where I kept a few emergency bills, and the envelope was gone. Confrontation came like thunder. We stood in the living room, the air thick with the smell of fried food from the dinner left untouched on the stove. My voice rose before I meant it to. "You think I sold this house so you could throw it all away again?" His face hardened. "That's not fair. I'm trying, Dad. I'm trying." "Trying," I snapped. "Is that what you call vanishing at night, coming home stinking of liquor, stealing from me?" The word landed heavier than I intended, stealing, but it was the truth. And the truth has a way of cutting deeper than any lie. For a long moment, we stared at each other, the space between us filled with years of love twisted now into accusation. Finally, he spat back. "You think this is all my fault? You think I asked you to sell the house? You made that choice." The words hit me harder than a fist, because in a way he was right. I had made that choice. But hearing him throw it back at me like a weapon instead of a lifeline was something I never imagined. The silence that followed was worse than the shouting. He stormed off, the slam of the door rattling the picture frames on the wall. I stood there alone, the smell of burnt food thick in the air, the weight of betrayal pressing down heavier than ever before. It wasn't just the money. It wasn't even the drinking. It was the realization that no matter what I had given, it might never be enough to pull him back. And for the first time, I wondered if saving him meant losing myself completely. By noon, I no longer owned the sound of my own footsteps. No storm, no dramatic sign, just the sound of boxes being taped shut and the hollow thud of footsteps echoing in rooms that had once been filled with life. I walked slowly through each corner of the house, my hand brushing along the walls as though I could memorize their texture. The faint ridges of old paint, the cool plaster beneath. Every mark told a story. A dent near the hallway where my son had once crashed a toy car. A faint ring on the kitchen counter from too many late-night cups of coffee. But stories don't hold weight on contracts, and stories don't buy time from men who come to collect debts. By afternoon, the house was no longer mine. I handed over the keys, the cold metal pressing into my palm one last time before leaving me forever. It was the strangest thing, to stand on the porch, to see the door close from the outside, and to know I was now a guest where I had once been a king. The room I rented was nothing more than a box, 4 walls, a narrow bed, a window that looked onto the cracked bricks of another building. The sheets smelled faintly of bleach, sharp and chemical, so different from the familiar warmth of linen dried under the sun in my own backyard. The radiator hissed in the corner, spitting out bursts of uneven heat. Pipes clanked inside the walls as if the building groaned under the weight of too many lives stacked together. The ceiling bore a water stain in the shape of a continent, brown edges bleeding outward as though the world itself had collapsed above me. I sat on the bed. Its springs creaked under my weight, not in recognition, but in protest. For the first time in decades, I had no place that was mine. No shelter I had built with my own hands. Only this temporary cage dressed up as a room. The first night was the hardest. Every sound was foreign. The muffled argument of neighbors bleeding through the walls, the steady hum of traffic from the street outside, the faint buzz of a neon sign that flickered in the window until dawn. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my body restless, my chest heavy. The mattress smelled faintly of smoke despite the bleach, and each breath reminded me that I was sleeping in the residue of other men's lives. At home, my real home, I had always known the rhythm of the night, the gentle groan of wood, The sigh of the wind through the maple trees, the quiet comfort of a house that knew me. Here there was only intrusion, a chorus of strangers' lives I had been forced to join. Still, I told myself this was the price of love, that a father's duty did not come cheap, that walls, roofs, furniture, they were replaceable, but a son was not. And yet, even as I repeated those words, I felt something inside me fray, because sacrifice is easier to bear when it's silent, when no one is watching. But the world has a way of peering in. The next morning I stopped by a diner near the boarding house, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted of burnt beans. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, asked where I was staying. When I told her, she hesitated just for a moment, before nodding too quickly, her smile stiffening like a curtain pulled closed. That hesitation was enough. It told me the truth I had feared. People would talk. Neighbors would wonder why I'd left the home I had cherished for so long. They would whisper that I had lost it, that I had gambled or failed or gone mad. And my son who should have been my defender, kept his silence. Nights turned into a pattern of survival. Microwave dinners eaten in silence. Clothes folded into a suitcase because there was no closet to claim. Photographs left behind because there was no shelf worthy of them. I tried to remind myself this was temporary, that I had given up a house to save a life. But when I caught my reflection in the warped glass of the bathroom mirror, I saw a man who looked displaced, a man without an anchor, and the hardest truth pressed against me in those narrow walls. I had saved my son from debt, but in doing so, I had lost the ground beneath my own feet. First time I heard it, it came not from strangers, but from voices I had once trusted. Two women stood outside the grocery store, their carts heavy with paper bags. Their words drifted through the autumn air, soft but sharp, like knives wrapped in cloth. "Did you hear? He sold the house. After all those years, for what? They say it was the boy, gambling. Can you imagine?" I froze in place, a bag of flour balanced in my arms. They hadn't noticed me yet, and for a moment, I almost wished they never would, because it was easier to be invisible than to see the pity in their eyes. When one of them finally turned and saw me, her smile flickered, thin, brittle, the kind of smile people wear when they don't know whether to comfort you or protect themselves from your misfortune. "Good morning," she said, her voice too bright, too polished, as if she could erase the words I had already heard. I nodded, forced my feet to move, and carried my flour to the counter. But inside something burned, not anger, not yet, but the slow ache of humiliation. In small towns, stories spread faster than truth. By the end of that week, everywhere I went, I could feel it, the sideways glances, the hushed tones that stopped the moment I stepped into a room. At the diner, forks clinked louder than usual. Conversations shifted mid-sentence. On the street, old friends crossed to the other side, not out of cruelty, perhaps, but out of discomfort. To them, I was no longer the man who had built a home with his hands, who had worked double shifts to keep food on the table. I was the father who had lost everything for a son who couldn't be trusted. One evening, as I walked back to my rented room, I passed my old street. The house stood there, lit from within, shadows of strangers moving through the windows. The new owners had already painted the shutters a brighter shade of blue, as if erasing me with every stroke of their brush. Across the road, a neighbor I had known for decades stood watering her flowers. She looked up, met my eyes, and quickly looked down again, pretending to fuss with the hose. The spray of water caught the light, a shimmering arc between us, but it felt more like a wall. I carried these moments with me like stones in my pocket, each whisper, each glance, each silence. Alone, they might have been bearable, but together they weighed heavy. What cut deepest wasn't the gossip itself, but the realization that people measured my worth not by the years I had given, but by the ruin I carried now. They didn't see sacrifice. They saw weakness. And my son, the reason for it all, rarely walked with me anymore. He kept his distance, whether out of shame or avoidance I couldn't tell. But I felt the absence like a wound that refused to close. One Sunday I sat at the back of the church. The pews creaked as families filled the rows, the air heavy with the scent of old wood polish and candle wax. When the pastor spoke of forgiveness, heads turned subtly, almost imperceptibly, but enough for me to feel it, as though forgiveness was something I needed to beg for, not something my son had yet to seek. I bowed my head, not to pray, but to hide the heat rising in my face. The whispers followed me even in solitude. At night in that narrow rented room, I could hear echoes of them in the walls, my neighbors on the other side speaking too low for words, but high enough for judgment. Sometimes I lay there imagining their phrases. Poor man, foolish. Didn't he know better? The radiator hissed, the neon sign buzzed, and I closed my eyes, trying to drown out voices that weren't even there. And yet beneath the humiliation, a strange clarity began to form, because whispers cannot change the truth. They can wound pride, yes. They can isolate, but they cannot rewrite why I had done what I did. The world saw failure, but I knew the choice had been born of love, the kind that bends until it breaks, the kind that trades comfort for survival. I bore the whispers, because I knew the debt I had paid was not just my son's, it was mine too. A debt to fatherhood, a debt to love itself. And debts, once taken, must always be paid. It began with little things. A slip of paper half crumpled in the trash, covered in numbers I didn't recognize. A folded receipt for cash withdrawn from an account I thought had been emptied long ago. The faint smell of cigarette smoke clinging to his jacket, sharper now, more constant. I told myself it was nothing. That suspicion was the voice of fear, not fact. I had already given up so much I couldn't bear to think it had been for nothing. But denial is a fragile wall, and truth has a way of breaking through. One night I returned later than usual. The hallway of the boarding house carried the stale odor of fried onions from someone's dinner, mingled with the faint musk of damp coats hung by the door. My feet dragged. I was tired in a way that lived in the bones, not the muscles. As I reached my room, I heard it, the low murmur of his voice, sharp and urgent, leaking through the thin plaster walls. I froze, my hand on the doorknob. There was laughter on the other end of the line, muffled, distant. Then his words, each one slicing through me. I'll win it back this time. I swear, just give me one more chance. The silence that followed seemed endless. Then he added, softer, almost a plea. My old man doesn't know, he won't find out. I felt the blood drain from my body. The door in front of me seemed heavier than stone. When I finally pushed it open, the hinges let out a squeal, and he jerked upright on the bed, the phone still glowing in his hand. Who was that? I asked. His eyes flickered, a split second of panic before he plastered on a smile too wide, too false. Just a friend, he said. His voice was casual, but his fingers twitched against the phone, as if they knew the lie before his mouth had spoken it. I stepped closer. The floorboards groaned under my weight. I held out my hand. Give me the phone. For a moment he didn't move. The air between us thickened. The hum of the radiator suddenly loud, each second stretching into eternity. Finally, with a sigh heavy with defiance, he slapped the phone into my palm. The screen was still lit. Messages glared up at me. Numbers and names I recognized too well, betting apps, loan sharks, a trail of desperation dressed as opportunity. My chest tightened. I had thought whispers in town were the worst humiliation I could bear. But this was betrayal carved raw. After everything, I whispered. The words trembled out of me, not loud, but enough to make him flinch. After the house, after all of it, you're still gambling. He stood, his hands outstretched, as if he could calm a storm he had summoned. Dad, listen, this time is different. I've got a system. I can fix it, I swear. Fix it. The words tore from me before I could stop them. You think this is fixing it? Selling my life so you can destroy yours twice as fast? His face twisted, anger flashing where shame should have been. Don't act like you're perfect. You think I asked for your sacrifice? You chose it. You threw away that house, your house, not me. The air left the room. I stared at him, the boy I had carried, the man I had saved, and I realized he no longer saw it as salvation. To him it was a burden, an unwanted chain wrapped around his neck. The phone slipped from my hand and hit the floor with a dull crack. The sound startled us both, a punctuation mark in a sentence neither of us could finish. I turned away. The room smelled of stale sweat and cigarette ash, the air so heavy I felt it pressing against my skin. My throat burned with words I couldn't bring myself to speak. When I finally did, my voice was quiet, hollow. You've broken more than trust, son. You've broken the only thing I had left to give. He said nothing. Only stood there, fists clenched, jaw tight, like a boy caught in the act but too proud to admit defeat. And in that silence, I knew the cruel truth. I had sold my home, my history, my life's work, and still it hadn't been enough. The room was too small for the weight between us. The radiator hissed in the corner, spitting bursts of heat that made the air feel thick, suffocating. I stood near the window, the neon glow from the sign outside staining the wall in an ugly red. Behind me, my son shifted restlessly, his footsteps dragging against the warped floorboards. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence was louder than any words we might have said. It pressed down until finally I turned, unable to hold it anymore. "Why, son?" My voice cracked on the word, softer than I intended, yet heavy with everything I carried. "Why, after all this, after the house, after everything, I find you back in it again?" He opened his mouth, but no words came. His jaw worked, his eyes darted, and for a moment I thought he might crumble. Pride built its wall faster than regret could tear it down. "I told you," he said finally, his voice sharp, defensive. "I can win it back, I can make this right." I let out a laugh, but it was hollow, bitter, a sound that tasted of rust in my throat. "Make it right by digging the same grave twice. Do you even hear yourself?" He took a step closer, his eyes blazing. "You think I wanted this? You think I wanted you to sell everything? You made that choice, not me." The words hit harder than fists. My breath caught in my chest. I had expected excuses, maybe lies, but not this, not the cruel dismissal of sacrifice. "You think I did it for me?" I whispered, each syllable dragging out of me like shards of glass. "I gave up the only thing I had left because I thought your life was worth more than my comfort." His face twisted, confusion and anger warring in his expression. He clenched his fists, then unclenched them like a child on the verge of a tantrum, like a man who didn't know how to carry his own shame. The tears came suddenly, first in his eyes, then in mine. Not gentle, not quiet, but raw, hot, burning down our faces as if grief itself had chosen to reveal the truth. "Dad," he whispered, his voice breaking in a way I hadn't heard since he was a boy. "I don't know how to stop." And there it was, the confession, the words that ripped through the walls of anger and pride and landed in the place I had feared most. I moved closer, my chest trembling, my hands aching with the need to reach for him. But I stopped because the pain was too wide between us. "Do you understand what this has done to me?" I asked. "My bed is not my bed. My house is gone. I wake each morning in a room that smells of smoke and strangers' lives. And all I have left is the thought that maybe, just maybe, you'd finally stand up." His tears fell freely now, his shoulders shaking. But he still shook his head, still clung to something I couldn't name. "I can't be who you want me to be," he choked out. "I don't know how." The sound of his sobs filled the room, a jagged rhythm, raw and unsteady. I felt my own tears blur the neon glow outside, red and broken as though the world itself was bleeding with us. I wanted to hold him. I wanted to tell him it was all right, that we'd find a way through. But the words would not come, because the truth sat heavy in my chest. Love cannot cure what someone refuses to surrender. Finally, I sank into the chair by the table. The wood creaked under me, echoing the fracture in my spirit. I pressed my palms to my eyes, my body shaking with the force of grief. Across from me he stood trembling, his face blotched red, his chest heaving as though he'd run miles without moving an inch. And in that fragile, tear-soaked silence, we were no longer father and son divided by anger. We were just two broken men, each drowning in his own way, each begging the other for rescue, yet neither strong enough to reach the shore. It was the town meeting that pulled us both into the light, held in the church basement as it always was, rows of metal chairs scraping against linoleum, the smell of burnt coffee and powdered donuts hanging heavy in the air. Neighbors filled the room with their chatter, their coats draped over the backs of chairs, their voices overlapping until it sounded like the restless buzz of a beehive. I had not wanted to come, but a letter had arrived, city notices, zoning changes, and habit drove me here. The life I had lived before demanded attendance, though that life no longer belonged to me. My son walked in behind me, his shoulders slouched, his hoodie pulled tight, his eyes scanning the floor as if hoping to vanish into it. I had told him to stay home. He refused. Perhaps some part of him wanted to prove he could still face the world. At first, the meeting went on in its usual rhythm. Reports read in monotone, questions raised about potholes and playgrounds. But I felt it, the weight of eyes. People didn't stare directly, but I knew. The whispers that had followed me in the grocery aisles had only grown louder. And then, like a match struck in dry grass, it happened. A man across the room cleared his throat. Broad-shouldered, a neighbor I had once lent tools to. His voice carried easily in the low-ceilinged hall. Maybe, he said, before we discuss spending more money on town projects, we should remember some of us can't even keep their own finances in order. The room hushed. His eyes flicked toward me. It was not subtle. It did not need to be. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I felt my son stiffen beside me, his breath sharp, quick. "Leave it," I whispered under my breath. But he didn't. He shot up from his chair, the metal legs screeching against the floor. "That's none of your damn business," he barked, his voice cracking under the strain of anger. Heads turned, conversations froze. In an instant the whispers had form, a stage, an audience, and we were center of it. The man leaned back, arms crossed. "Everyone knows, kid, your father sold the house. Years of work gone, and why? To cover your gambling tabs." The words fell like stones into still water, each one sending ripples that widened, touching every ear in the room. Stood my legs trembling. "Enough," I said, my voice louder than I intended, but the damage was already done. The crowd had their story and they would not let it go. Questions burst like fireworks. "Is it true? After all that work on the house, what did you do to him?" I saw my son's face flush red, anger and shame battling across his features. His fists clenched at his sides, and I knew he was seconds away from lashing out. "Stop," I said again, this time to him, pleading, my voice raw, but he turned, his eyes wild. "They don't know," he shouted at me. "They don't know what it's like to live with your expectations, with your damn sacrifices hanging over my head like chains." Gasps rippled through the room. The church basement seemed to tilt, the air growing tighter, hotter. My chest ached as if a hand had reached in and squeezed. This was not just humiliation. This was disintegration, happening in front of neighbors, friends, strangers. I opened my mouth to answer him, but no words came. Only tears burned at the corners of my eyes. The man who had spoken first shook his head. "Pathetic," he muttered, loud enough for all to hear. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some looked away. Some stared openly, hungry for the spectacle. And in that moment I felt stripped bare, not just a father who had failed, but a man dismantled in the eyes of his own community. My son slammed his chair back into place and stormed out, the door swinging hard, the sound reverberating through the hall. The room remained silent, save for the hum of fluorescent lights above. Dozens of eyes bore into me, some pitying, some condemning, none kind. I lowered myself back into my chair, my hands trembling in my lap. The taste of salt and iron filled my mouth, though I hadn't bitten my tongue. What broke me wasn't the gossip, nor the accusations. It was the realization that my son, the boy I had sacrificed everything for, had just torn the last shreds of trust from me, in front of the world. The night after the meeting, the city seemed quieter than usual. The streets were slick with rain, reflecting street lamps in broken streaks of gold. Every step home felt heavy, my shoes squelching against the pavement, the echo of voices from that basement still clinging to me like smoke. When I opened the door to our small rented room, I found him sitting in the dark. No television, no music, just him hunched forward on the edge of the bed, his hands buried in his hair. The air smelled of damp wool from his jacket, of stale takeout boxes piled in the corner. The radiator clicked but gave no heat. It felt less like a home than a cell. He didn't look up when I entered. I set my coat on the chair, the fabric still dripping rain onto the warped floorboards. "You embarrass me tonight," I said quietly, my voice too tired to hold anger. He lifted his head, and for the first time in a long while, I saw something raw in his eyes, not defiance, not pride, but fear. "I know," he whispered. His voice was so small it barely reached me. "I know I did." I sat across from him, the chair creaking beneath me. The distance between us was only a few feet, yet it felt like a chasm carved by years of pain. "They looked at me like I was nothing," I said. "Like I was a fool who threw his life away, and maybe I am. But you—" I stopped, unable to finish. The words pressed hard in my chest. He leaned forward, his hands trembling. "I can't stop seeing it," he said. "The way they stared, like I wasn't even human anymore, like I was a curse walking into the room." His voice cracked, and suddenly he wasn't the man who had shouted at me hours before. He was my son again, a boy stripped of all his armor. "They hate me, Dad." His shoulders shook. "They don't even know me, but they hate me." I wanted to tell him it wasn't hate, that it was fear, pity, disgust, anything but hate, but the truth was I didn't know. And in that moment silence felt kinder than lies. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, leaving streaks across his skin. His breaths came ragged, like each one scraped him raw. "I never wanted you to lose the house," he said suddenly. The words tumbled out like stones. "I thought I could fix it before you knew, but I didn't. I never fix anything. Just break it." The room held still. Even the hum of the neon sign outside seemed to quiet, and for the first time I believed he saw himself clearly. I leaned forward, my elbows resting on my knees, my hands hanging loose between them. "You've broken a lot," I said softly. "More than money, more than walls and roofs. You've broken trust, son, and that's the hardest thing to rebuild." His chin dropped to his chest. Tears splattered against the floor, darkening the wood in uneven circles. "I don't know how to change," he whispered. "I don't even know where to start." Something in me shifted then, not forgiveness, not yet, but a faint thread of hope, thin as spider silk, that maybe the boy I raised still lived inside the man across from me. I reached out slowly and placed my hand on his shoulder. The fabric of his hoodie was damp, chilled from the rain. Beneath it, his body trembled like a wire stretched too tight. "You start," I said, "by admitting you can't do it alone." The words hung there, fragile but true. He nodded once, his eyes still hidden, but his breathing steadied as though he had been waiting for permission to surrender. We sat like that for a long while, two men in a room too small for our pain, yet finally wide enough for something else to enter. Not reconciliation, not yet, but the faintest possibility of change. And though the rain still beat against the window, for the first time in months, I felt the air shift inside that room. It was not peace, but it was a turning. The morning we walked into the rehabilitation center, the air carried a sharp bite of winter. Frost clung to the edges of car windows, and the ground crunched beneath our boots. The building stood at the end of a quiet street, brick walls the color of rust, windows narrow and plain, as though determined not to promise more comfort than it could give. My son walked a step behind me. His hood was pulled tight, hands buried in his pockets, each stride hesitant, like he was approaching a courtroom instead of a place meant for healing. I pushed open the glass door. The lobby smelled faintly of disinfectant, overlaid with the bitter scent of burnt coffee from a machine in the corner. Chairs lined the wall, their cushions worn thin. A stack of pamphlets fanned across a table. Words like recovery, relapse prevention, second chances printed in bold, hopeful fonts. At the desk, a woman greeted us. Her smile was professional but not unkind, the kind of smile that had seen hundreds walk in broken and only some walk out whole. "Intake forms," she said gently, sliding papers across the counter. My son shifted from foot to foot, his eyes fixed anywhere but on the forms. For a moment I thought he might turn and leave. The urge radiated off him, the pull of flight, the terror of commitment. I placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. It was the same gesture I had given him as a boy, when he stood frozen before the deep end of the pool. "Just one step," I whispered. "Start with one." He picked up the pen. His fingers trembled, the click of plastic loud in the stillness. He bent over the forms, his handwriting jagged, hurried, as if putting his name down was more painful than confessing the truth aloud. When he slid the papers back, I caught a glimpse of his signature. It looked unfamiliar, like the scrawl of someone I didn't recognize, but maybe that was the point. Maybe he was already shedding the skin of the boy I'd known and becoming someone new. A counselor appeared, a tall man with kind eyes and a clipboard hugged to his chest. He introduced himself and then looked to my son. "Ready?" he asked. The question seemed simple, but I saw the pause before the answer, the tiny war playing out in my son's throat. Finally, he nodded. Not confidently, but enough. I stayed behind as they walked down the hall. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the linoleum, then faded into a door that clicked shut. I sat in one of the waiting chairs, the vinyl cold beneath me, my hands folded tight in my lap. Through the wall, faint sounds reached me. A cough, a voice raised in frustration, a distant laugh too brittle to be joy. I closed my eyes. For the first time in years, I let myself exhale without fear of a phone call, without fear of men waiting at the door. But the breath carried no peace, only the fragile awareness that this was just a beginning. When he returned an hour later, his face was pale but softer somehow, as though something had loosened inside him. The counselor walked him back, a hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "We'll take it one day at a time," the man said. He spoke to my son, but I felt the words settle into me too. One day at a time. That was all we were promised. That night back in our small rented room, sat at the table with a glass of water. The neon light outside painted his face in shifting shades of red and pink. He didn't speak for a long time. Then softly he said, "I don't know if I can do this." I looked at him, at the boy who had begged for rescue, the man who had betrayed that rescue, and now the fragile figure before me, trying to climb out of a pit he had dug with his own hands. "You don't have to know," I said. "You just have to try." He nodded, his fingers tracing the rim of the glass. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't redemption. But it was the first step. And sometimes the first step is all you can ask for. The first night he slept among strangers, the room forgot my name. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage from someone's dinner, a sour heaviness that clung to the peeling wallpaper. Keys jingled in my hand as I unlocked the door, the metal cool against my fingers, the sound too loud in the emptiness that waited inside. When I stepped in, the silence pressed hard, no shuffle of his restless pacing. No muttered curses under his breath, no second breath at all, just mine, rough, uneven, as if the room itself had grown larger without him. The bed stood in its corner, sheets pulled taut in a way the landlord had left them. Beside it, the single dresser leaned slightly, its top scarred with cigarette burns from tenants before me. A faint draft slipped in through the cracked window frame, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the occasional blare of a horn. I sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped beneath my weight, its springs squealing like a protest. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, hands clasped, the old posture of a man praying though no words came. Across the room, a mirror hung crooked on the wall. In its glass, I saw myself, shoulders stooped, eyes shadowed, the lines of my face carved deeper than I remembered. Grief and fatigue had aged me more than years ever could. I pulled open the small drawer beside the bed. Inside, I kept the few things I had carried with me when I left the house: a wallet, a folded shirt, and one photograph. It showed us years ago, standing in front of the house on the day it was finished. My son, still a boy, balanced on my shoulders, his hands stretched wide as if he could touch the sky. Behind us, the walls gleamed fresh with paint, the windows reflecting sunlight like they had captured it for us. I traced the edge of the picture with my thumb. The corners had curled, and a faint crease split the image where it had been bent too often. But the faces were still there, mine proud, his joyous. I wondered what that boy would say if he could see the man he had become, and what that father would think of the man I had turned into. The radiator rattled to life, spitting out heat in uneven bursts. The air grew heavy, but not warm enough to soften the sharp edges of the night. I stretched out on the bed, my body aching as though the springs pressed straight into my bones. I thought of my son then, sleeping in a different room miles away. Not this one, not the house we lost, but a sterile bed among strangers who carried their own ghosts. Was he lying awake like I was? Was he fighting the urge to run? Or had exhaustion finally pulled him under? The ceiling above me bore the water stain I had memorized, its outline jagged, like a map to a country I'd never reach. I let my eyes follow its curves, tracing borders that meant nothing until my vision blurred. It struck me then. Home is not always a place. Sometimes it's the sound of a voice in the next room, the weight of someone's footsteps in the hall, the certainty that when you open the door, you will not face silence. And without him here, even broken as he was, the absence roared louder than any crowd. I rose before dawn, unable to stay still. The window glass was cold beneath my palm. Outside, the street was empty, lamps still glowing faintly against the gray wash of morning. A newspaper truck rattled past, its brakes squealing, the sharp scent of ink spilling into the air as bundles hit the pavement. I closed my eyes, inhaling the moment. The world carried on, unbothered, relentless, and I, a man in a rented room, stood suspended between past and future. On the table, the photograph still waited. I picked it up again, my hand trembling just enough for the image to blur. I pressed it against my chest, feeling the thin paper crinkle against my shirt. "I'm still here," I whispered to the boy in the picture. "I'm still trying." The room gave no answer, only the faint buzz of the neon sign outside, its light pulsing through the curtains like a heartbeat not my own. And in that lonely rhythm, I endured the night, clinging to the fragile hope that my sacrifice had not been wasted. The rehab center smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant, a sharp cleanliness that tried but failed to cover the human weight of the place. Voices carried down the hallway, low conversations, the occasional laugh that cracked too quickly, a cough echoing against painted cinder block walls. I sat in the visitor's lounge, a narrow room with a row of mismatched chairs, and a vending machine humming loudly in the corner. My hands rested on my knees, the photograph I always carried folded in my wallet, its edges worn smooth by my touch. The door opened and my son stepped through. He looked thinner, paler, but his eyes, though rimmed with exhaustion, held a clarity I had not seen in years. He sat across from me, his shoulders tense, his fingers tugging at a loose thread on the hem of his shirt. For a moment we simply looked at each other. No words, just the weight of everything unspoken filling the space between us. Finally, he broke the silence. "Dad," he said softly, "do you regret it?" I frowned. Regret what? Selling the house, losing everything for me. The words hung in the air, heavier than any I had heard in months. I leaned back, feeling the vinyl chair creak beneath me. My throat tightened because I had known this question would come, but I had never rehearsed the answer. I looked at him, at the lines of strain etched too early into his young face, at the way his hands shook slightly even as he tried to hide them. And then I spoke. "Son," I said, my voice slow, "I built that house with my own hands. Every nail, every beam, every coat of paint, it carried a piece of me. It was my pride, my anchor, the proof that I had taken all my sweat, all my years, and turned them into something solid. But walls don't breathe, bricks don't bleed, and a roof won't sit by your bedside when you're broken. So no," I shook my head, feeling the sting of tears gather at the corners of my eyes. "No, I don't regret it, because what good is a home if my son isn't alive to walk through its door?" He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as though the words had lodged in his throat. His eyes shimmered, and he pressed the heel of his palm against them, as if embarrassed to let me see. "You gave up everything," he whispered, "and I threw it back in your face." The vending machine hummed louder, the fluorescent light above us flickering once, but neither of us moved. "I know," I said quietly, and it cut me deeper than anything else, "but sacrifice isn't about getting something back. It isn't a bargain, it's giving because love leaves you no other choice." His head dropped into his hands. For a moment I thought he might break completely. His shoulders shook, a soundless sob tearing through him. When he lifted his face again, his cheeks were wet, his voice trembling. "I don't deserve that kind of love." I leaned forward, reaching across the space between us. A hand found his, the skin rough, the knuckles scarred from years of fists clenched too tightly. "None of us do," I said. "That's why it's love, because it isn't earned, it's given." The room was quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock. Each second seemed to stretch long and thin, like time itself was holding its breath. I thought of the nights alone in my rented room, the cold sheets, the silence that pressed in too close. I thought of the humiliation in the town hall, the whispers that trailed me down the grocery aisle, all of it, all the weight. And here in this moment it seemed worth it, just to see my son begin to understand. He squeezed my hand once, hesitant but firm enough to let me know he was still there. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough but steady. "I want to make it right, Dad. I don't know how long it'll take, but I want to try." A warmth spread through me then, not relief, not triumph, but something quieter, something like faith. I nodded, the tears finally falling, soft trails down my face. "That's all I've ever asked, son," I said. "That you try, because I'll carry the rest as long as it takes." By January thaw, when the snow melted into gray slush at the corners of Maple Creek streets, something in me had begun to soften too. The trees stood bare and brittle, their branches etched like veins against a pale sky, and the air still carried a sting each morning. But inside me, something had begun to soften, not because the world had grown kinder, not because my circumstances had changed. I was still in that rented room, still sleeping on a bed that complained with every turn, but my son was trying, and that made all the difference. Every Sunday I visited him at the center. We would sit across from each other in the visitors' lounge, sometimes talking, sometimes silent. He told me about the group sessions, the hard confessions, the nights when cravings gripped him so tightly he thought he might break. I listened, and for once I didn't try to fix it. I let him speak, let him wrestle with his own ghosts, because I had learned that saving someone isn't about building a shield around them. It's about giving them the strength to stand, even if their legs tremble. There were setbacks. One week he looked pale and withdrawn, his words clipped, his eyes clouded. I knew then he had slipped, but instead of hiding, he told me. He admitted it out loud. And though it hurt to hear, I realized honesty was its own kind of progress. I told him I was proud. Not proud of the mistake, but proud of the courage it took to name it. He cried then, his hands pressed to his face, and for the first time I saw not the addict, not the broken man, but my son, fragile, fighting, but alive. Nights in the rented room grew quieter after that. Loneliness remained, but it no longer felt like punishment. It felt like part of the price. And slowly I learned to accept that. Some evenings I sat by the window, watching the neon sign buzz and flicker. I thought about the house we had lost, the walls that once carried laughter, the floors that had known the weight of our lives. I missed it. I would always miss it. But I no longer mourned it as a death. I began to see it as a sacrifice placed on the altar of love, an offering that, though costly, had given my son another chance to breathe. Spring arrived with its first shy blooms. On visiting day we walked outside together, the air fresh, the grass just beginning to green. He bent down and touched a small flower pushing through the dirt. "It's fragile," he said, "but it's still growing." I nodded, feeling the words settle deep inside me. That night back in my room I thought about what he had said, and it struck me that maybe that's all life is, fragile things growing despite the weight of the world pressing down. A son, a father, a bond that refuses to disappear even when tested to breaking. I don't know what tomorrow holds. Maybe he will stumble again. Maybe he will rise stronger. Maybe I will never see the house we once had or the security I gave away. But I know this, I do not regret it, because the measure of a life is not in what we keep. It is in what we give away, even when it costs us everything. So I leave you, the listener, with this. If the moment came, if the choice stood before you to hold on to comfort or to save the one you love, what would you do? Would you cling to the walls you built, or would you let them fall so that someone else might stand? There is no easy answer. Sacrifice never is, but I can tell you this, even in my rented room with its cracked walls and its second-hand bed, I carry a peace that no house ever gave me, because my son still lives, and that is enough. Thank you, my friends, for staying with me through this story. If it touched you, if it made you think of your own family, I ask you to share it, not just this video, but the message, that love is strongest when it costs us something. Please remember to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next story we'll share together. I wish you health, I wish you peace, and above all, I wish you the kind of love that makes even sacrifice worthwhile. Until next time, take care of yourselves and hold your families close.